everybody. I am so excited today. I have someone who is a special guest that I'm getting to interview one-on-one as we prepare for our event around helping people early in their careers think about the ideas that Third Path is so dedicated to, which is basically having work be part of our lives, but not all of our lives. And I have the privilege of having Rainesford Stauffer here today. She's written two amazing books. As soon as I read her first book, An Ordinary Age, I knew I wanted to get in touch with her because you will quickly see as we talk to her today, she really is speaking around the hearts of young adulthood and what is influencing their lives today and how they can take some of the things that are challenging and instead shift them to be something that helps them create the life that they want. And at Third Path, we've always known the more you can learn this early in your career, the more you can really create a life that really encompasses work and other life priorities. She's followed it up with another great book, All the Gold Stars, where she really looks deeper at this issue about how work can be so all-consuming and what are some of the factors around the systems that kind of make this work achievement such a big focus for too many of us, not the ones who are trying to learn from Third Path though. So Rainesford, I am so glad you are here today. I'm going to show you one of the first things that we're going to start talking about, which is this idea that work can really consume so much of our lives. And yes, we've now maybe moved towards hybrid workplaces so people don't have to go into work as much. But as we've been talking about at Third Path all year long, it's not just about where you work. It's that picture on the right. It's how much we work and how much it can take over more of our time and energy than we want. Tell us more about what you've been learning around this, the forces that really push work to be so all-consuming. Thanks for being here, Rainesford.
Sure. So I think first thought that I have on this is that it's important to kind of situate this sense of overwork in context. And I think overwork is a systemic crisis that I think about in two ways. I think first, we have to name the obvious is that work consumes us because America ties everything to work, where you live, how you live, ensuring your basic needs are met, when your healthcare, your home, your ability to feed yourself and your loved ones, childcare and other forms of care, and all of these basic needs are so tethered to how much you work and how much you make, it's nearly impossible to not let work consume you. And we also know that overwork isn't equally applied because there's research that shows that women and people of color are disproportionately likely to have jobs that pay low wages, and with that are less likely to have access to things like medical leave, paid family care, fair scheduling. So I think that that's the big one, that larger context of why overwork is such a factor in so many people's lives. And then second, I think there's another way work consumes us that is really tethered to that first one. I think that work as a way of making meaning or proving worthiness via our productivity. Because of this capitalistic notion that what we produce is what we're worth, that manifests in all kinds of ways, including work becoming the center focus of our lives, the thing that our well-being, our identities, all our time sort of orbits around. And if your work is part of who you are or feels personal to you in some way, it makes sense that it could very easily become something that feels all-consuming. But one of the things that I found so interesting when researching the second book in particular is that when our passions devour us to the extent that we lose the ability to have other interests, to show up for other people, to think about how we're showing up in communities in general, we lose so much energy, curiosity, and growth. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we need structural changes to work that don't force us to be ambitious or overwork to have something as basic as our basic needs met, and don't rely on overwork as this driver of security and self-worth, where workers can have more autonomy, more agency, and more collective power to decide what work needs to look like for them.
Yeah, you're speaking our language. And you know what's been fun, last year we had a couple of times where we talked about an emerging trend of 4-day work weeks where people are being paid the same working 4 days a week, and the organizations are earning the same amount. That's why everybody can be paid the same, because they've gotten smarter around how they do their work. So this is not an impossible thing. There are organizations that are already thinking smarter about how they want work to be just part of their own lives, the leaders' lives and their employees' lives, and creating a workplace that really supports people to have more time for, like you said, these other important life interests. And that's something else you raised in your book, which is we all need time to recharge. It's really important for us to, yes, work is, I'm at a life stage where, I've raised children, I have dealt with elder care, so I had work, I had family responsibilities, but I also was very smart that it's really important to take time to recharge. And here's a simple example of how I've seen this change over time. The act of actually like turning off work on vacation. I can't tell you, Rainesford, how many people say, I can't turn off work on vacation. I've got to I've got to be tethered to email or my cell phone. And to me, there's many more examples I could give of how we've let work intrude on even our own self-care and recharge time. What have you learned around that?
Sure. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that there's this really faulty notion, I think, that self-care alone can heal us from exploitative systems. And I think it's important to name that up front, because I've spoken to a lot of people over the course of both books and just anecdotally who feel a lot of shame or a lot of guilt about their inability to unplug. They always feel like they're worried about work. They always feel like they're chronically never doing enough. And I think that when we see that as sort of an individualized behavior without this sort of larger context of what enforces those behaviors, it can lead to feeling really, really bad about yourself in that direction too. And the example I think of is, just like throwing your staff a pizza party to show your appreciation is not actually appreciating them the way, say, a raise would. Offering a yoga class or a meditation app subscription is not enough to tackle a working environment that's burning out or overworking employees. And I think if you have personal practices that help you sleep or rest or just feel a little bit better as you move through your day, I think those are fantastic. And I think that that probably looks a little bit different for every person. But I think that individualized self-care isn't the solution to structural issues at work. When workplaces offer quote unquote benefits like this, it's also worth asking, are they actually listening to employees on working conditions? Are they putting into place any structural policies that don't rely on employees using their time outside of work to essentially recover from work? What are their wages like? What about leave or flexible work policies? I think the thing that's come up for me is that self-care, fun, rest, pleasure, leisure, all of these things are not things that should have to be earned through overwork in order to access them. And I think when we think of, turning off work, I think that the big solutions are honestly the structural ones. I think that there are smaller things that each of us can do individually as our circumstances allow. Like you said, turning off emails or phone if you're working from home, maybe trying to work in one space and live in another space if that's something you've got access to. Refraining from work-related thoughts was a big one that came up in the reporting of the second book, kind of trying to have actual downtime where you are doing something that feels really nourishing or spending time with loved ones. And I think that the big thing that's come up about this for me is that we're all going to need different kinds of attention or care and rest depending on where we are in our lives, how we're feeling in our bodies, all of these different factors. And it just makes sense that we would push and advocate and build for work systems that allow us to feel, that allow us to rest, not rely on permission from work in order to do those things first.
Yeah, well said, really. This is a systemic problem. And I do like that you're hinting at that there are, in the meantime, waiting for the system to change, here are some things you can do that might also help us. In fact, that takes us to another wonderful thing you raise in the book, and it's this impact of social media. Speaking of things you can do, um, when we have the actual live event around this topic, one of the people who we interviewed will be sharing a story about how she turns off social media for the entire month of January. She just stops using social media for an entire month. She really likes being engaged in social media and wants to continue to be part of it, but it's almost like she has to detox herself from getting too reliant. And so there's this balance between, we live in a world that's kind of can be all consuming, and what can we do as individuals to push back to find our own better way around these factors that are pretty staggering and making life more challenging. What have you learned around social media and early career or early stage or young adulthood, and how to do it better, how to be smarter?
Oh my gosh, I think that that's probably still a work in progress, certainly for me and probably for all of us as we navigate different relationships with social media. I think honestly, it's changed so much even since I was a young adult that my advice is probably going to feel a little bit outdated. But one of the first things I'll say is that I know one of the pitfalls of social media that I think most of us have experienced in some way or another is this idea of comparison, where you're kind of constantly comparing the behind the scenes grind and messiness and chaos of your own life to the best parts of someone else's that you're seeing online. And one of the things that I found very interesting in talking to young adults a couple years ago now about this specifically is that I also don't think we should inherently feel shame around the comparison. I think that we're human beings and it is in our nature in some ways to look at other people's lives and seek out similarities or differences with our own. And I think that when we can spin it from comparison to being really curious, it can help kind of suck the air out of the particular pressure to perform in a certain way. But I think that another part of that is, what we consume online does not stay online. And again, I think that most of us have experienced this in some way now, where for some people, work is online, you've made friends online. I don't think drawing these firm distinctions between my online life and my offline life are always inherently helpful or possible. I think that what we can do instead is try to acknowledge that, number one, if you're comparing yourself to someone, you might notice that you're doing it. You don't have to beat yourself up about it. We've all done it. It's human. I think number two, kind of stemming off of that, is it's thinking about, okay, what is this comparison or this envy? What is it raising for me? Is it guilt that I'm not doing enough? Is it that I actually find this person pretty inspiring and am interested in what they're doing? I think kind of getting down to the root of that and doing that self-interrogation can be helpful. And then number three, I think that we live in a society where there are multiple industries, including social media and all of the companies advertising on it, that profit and benefit from us feeling inadequate and us feeling behind. And sometimes I think just reminding ourselves of that and kind of digging into what that looks like. I'm definitely not a social media reporter or expert, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that side of it, that there are people who are profiting off of that insecurity or that need to share the best parts of our life on the internet, even though we know we're seeing whatever someone has chosen to share, even if it's something that's vulnerable or imperfect. That is something they have chosen to share with us, and there are things that they are probably choosing not to share that might be really great or really bad, just like we are. And I think about this in terms of work. I think that because we spend so much of our time working, it's evident why people would want to do work they find meaningful or enjoyable in some way. And I know for a lot of people that includes work that is promoted online. That includes myself. I would probably not be on social media in the same way if it were not for the kind of work that I do. And so I think that drawing some boundaries wherever you can, whether it's deleting social media, whether it's kind of going through and figuring out what and who you follow and what's making you feel good and what's maybe making you feel not so good, and really investing in how you spend your time offline, have all things that have been personally helpful to me.
Yeah, No, that makes a lot of sense. And in fact, we're almost at the last two questions. And the last question I'm going to be asking, or we're going to be talking about with Rainesford, is this whole idea that life is a journey. And what I really hear you saying with social media, to take this kind of experimental approach and to notice, be curious, what's making you feel better, what's making you feel good, what's not, and kind of incorporating that into the decisions you make around how you use social media. Well, before we get to the life is a journey thing, another important part, or two parts of actually, so I had three more questions for you, Rainesford. One is, you talk about in the book how we are all learning about ourselves, and the more we can early on understand what's important to us, what are our strengths. I talk about something called an Achilles heel. I'm 62, so I have been on this journey of understanding what's important to me, what are my strengths, for a very long time. You don't really stop getting smart about it. But when you better understand, oh, this is the thing that kind of trips me up every time, you get quicker at understanding, that's what I do here. I'm going to try to do it slightly differently. And so there is, even though we're in these systems that are making it hard for us to live the life we want, what I took away from your writing was, there is something we can do to better understand who we are, to kind of overcome the challenges. What have you learned around kind of what our personal growth can have an influence on all of this?
I think that this is such an interesting and probably multi-layered question. I think, again, I think just because of the nature of my work, I have to bring up the stuff at the structural level, because while I believe very much in thinking about our own relationships to work and how we want to show up in our lives beyond them, I think that there's probably not a sufficient individualized way to solve the problem at the root. And when I spoke to people for the second book in particular, they pointed to a lot of tangible changes or policies that would make an impact on not just their work, but also their ambitions, their sense of self, their curiosity, their ability to maintain and sustain meaningful relationships in their community. And it was things like paid leave, universal basic income, care infrastructure, flexible work conditions. And what I thought was so interesting about that, among so many things, is that for so many people I spoke to in all different kinds of jobs, locations, circumstances, they mentioned that having more resources and support would make them more ambitious, not less. It would give them the capacity to do more and show up more in ways that felt more meaningful, not just to them personally, but to their communities, to their neighborhoods, to their friends, to their colleagues. And so I think, to me, that's the key question that has to come first, is what can be done to make people's material conditions and lives better and easier? How are our institutions and systems sustainably giving people the support they need to pursue those ambitions that matter to them, and that so everyone can live a dignified, fulfilled life, regardless of the job they do? I think that we really have to start there. And whether we know it or not, I think we can all play a role in that, whether or not we're policymakers. I think even talking about that with colleagues, talking about what that would look like in your workplace or in your community, really matters, at least according to the people I've spoken to. In terms of what I've done individually, again, this is still very much a work in progress, and it's probably always going to be. But the biggest takeaway for me is that I try to remind myself that doing what I can is probably better than doing nothing at all. And that sometimes giving yourself 100% to one thing is an unrealistic expectation. And it's an expectation we hear a lot. We hear that we should be giving 100% to school if we're a student, 100% to work if we're working, 100% at home, 100% at all of these things. And the simple math does not add up for that to be possible all the time. I've learned that for myself, there's likely never going to be a scenario where it feels like I'm doing quote unquote enough. I think that in part, that's my own personal thing as a person who's still unraveling her relationship to people pleasing and all of these avenues for trying to earn self-worth. But I also think, again, it goes back to this idea that there are entire systems that benefit from us feeling behind and trying to catch up. And so what I've done personally is I've started asking myself why I'm running or racing in the first place. And I've found that question very helpful. Is it because I financially need to? Is it because it's something I'm passionate about and want to make time for this, even if it involves some overwork? Is it because I feel like I should? And if so, what's making me feel that way? And to be transparent, sometimes that answer changes project to project or thing to thing, or even time in my life from time in my life, but it helps me reorient why I care about something. And I think that where we can, taking space to dig into those questions, why we're investing time in something, why it matters to us, and the way that it matters can really help clarify what we care about and what we want to pour into.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, a very, very astute and very connected to where I want to go next, which is, at the root of Third Path is the idea that work is important, but so is our community, so are our friends, so are our family, and the world I want to see great public policy created for is a world that supports us to have time for all these different aspects of our life, community, friends, and family. And speaking of this, need to, I think it's very common that we felt like, well, I got to get 100% of this and 100% of that. What we learned early on is we want to encourage people to think about an integrated life, that they have this and that. And how do you create time for more than a multi-dimensional life where you have time for, more than one thing? And it's certainly not that you can give 100% to everything, but instead you get smarter about how to approach each thing so that you feel more satisfied with those different activities. Find a creative solution for work that creates more space for your life. A simple example being, when I became a manager, getting smarter about how to delegate as a way to grow people was a simple example of how I could create some space for myself and also improve the lives of others. So I think there's ways we can think smarter about this integrated approach where it's work and these other things. And it's really critical. And that's why I liked both of your books so well, that you learn this early in your career because it's a mindset and there's some skills that we can all learn early in our careers that will keep on being used later on. And, we can rely on others to help us get smart about this. I mentioned this is a picture of me hanging out with some friends because my mother-in-law played a huge role in my life of helping out with our family. She would take our kids on a Friday night. My husband and I would have a date night. So there's many creative ways we can think about how to have this multifaceted life that supports work, but these other important things. What are some things you've learned around making time for friends, making time for family?
I think that, to your point, one of the most important things about this conversation is figuring out how to have the public policy and the structural component that gives everyone access to this, whether or not they feel like they have a supportive familial network or friends that they can turn to. I think that the thing that I keep relearning through my reporting, just speaking for myself personally, is that it's not enough for me to have access to these things. It's what can I do with the resources or knowledge I have to make sure or help make sure that everyone has access to this. And I think that that's why so much of it does come down to kind of these more systemic solutions. And I think the thing about so many of the systems that drive overwork or work being at the center of our lives is that they are often deeply and profoundly isolating. When people are encouraged to be in competition with each other rather than collaborative, when we're encouraged over and over that any real accomplishment, any real success means going it alone, we lose so much. And I think the deepest thing we lose is our connection to each other. And personally, sometimes I go through periods where my work does get more from me. It gets more of my time. I think that the biggest shift over the past couple of years is that I try to really intentionally counterbalance that with a focus on community, on friends and relationships, on life beyond work when I can. And a primary focus of my last few years, honestly, has been figuring out how I can better be of service to other people, which has required a lot of listening, a lot of decentering forms of my own ambition, a lot of figuring out how I want to show up in communities I'm part of and how I want to contribute. And in reporting I've done, for some people, this looked like deep commitments to their community or their neighborhood. It looked like being involved in mutual aid initiatives in their neighborhood, where maybe they couldn't devote all of their time to one single cause or one single issue, but they could be part of contributing to this larger whole. For some people, it looked like really investing in their friendships and scheduling a time to talk to a friend on the phone the same way that they would schedule a meeting for work. And again, this ebbs and flows. I think a major struggle of this is feeling like if you can't prioritize friends or other relationships or connections the way you'd ideally like to, it's not worth doing at all. Because it almost feels like a form of shirking responsibility on the thing that most of us know is most important. It's the other people in our lives that make life so rich and so fulfilling. And I felt like that for a long time, that if I couldn't do it the way I wanted to do it, I shouldn't do it at all. And I think that this is an area where it really is better to do a small, uneven, or inconsistent bit of this in the beginning and build up from there where you can. And then I think on the work side, we're seeing the same thing. I think the thing that so many incredible unionization and organizing efforts are demonstrating right now, among others, is that there are so many ways to take care of each other and to prioritize each other. And I think that, at least for me, that's a very central part of ambition, is figuring out not how we're going to individually achieve our goals, but how we can do that together.
Wow. Wow. And actually, such a concrete example I can give of this is on our very last Thursdays with ThirdPath event. We were talking with some very progressive managers, thinking about how they support their teams to have time off for vacations, et cetera, family responsibilities. And it's exactly what you were talking about. They had set up their teams to not think of themselves as working independently, but collectively, collaboratively. How do we do this together? And by seeing themselves as a collaborative group, trying to get a good job done at work, but also have time for their lives, they were much more successful in finding solutions to meeting both work and life responsibilities. So, you start this in your early career, these ideas of this kind of more multidimensional integrated life. And then over time, you become this integrated manager who supports your whole team to think smarter. Maybe you even become someone who's organizing change at an even bigger level in the way that Rainesford's talking about. All these are so important. So Rainesford, I wanted to give you this last chance to talk a little bit about something that I really took away from your book, that life is a journey. It is not going to stop at the early career point. Some of the things we're talking about today are things that keep on showing up across the life cycle. Certainly they are even familiar to me at a much later stage in the life cycle. So what advice do you have for people around this early stage of their careers? I know that I read some quotes from your book that really were meaningful to me, that failure is rarely final, that we are becoming more of ourselves all of the time, and that we can follow timelines that feel truest to us. Try to give ourselves permission where it's in our power to live as we are, not solely for who we could be. Thank you for these good insights. What else would you say to young adults about life is a journey?
First of all, thank you. I think a couple things. I think number one, because I'm apparently thinking in list format today, number one, I think that especially in young adulthood, this is probably true to some extent throughout the lifespan, but I think especially in young adulthood, there tends to be a hyperfixation on the future, on future goals, on making sure you're on the right path to get to those future goals. And I think that that's important. I think most of us like to sit and daydream about how we'd like our lives to look a month from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. But I would encourage people where they can, because I know this is so much easier said than done, to acknowledge where you are right now. And the fact that the younger version of you 5 years ago, in many cases, would probably be in shock and awe at how far you've come and the person that you are right now. And I think that that tends to get really lost in a society that is constantly encouraging us to do more and more and more and have the next thing figured out before we've even solved the first thing. So I think that that's number one is notice how far you've already come. Notice how your interests have changed and grown as you do. And I think keeping that in mind is a really underestimated way to remind yourself that there's so much value in where you are now. Your value is not only in your future self. I think number two, and very much related in my mind, is that because of these pressures to always do and be more, it's very easy to get yourself into a mindset where you feel like you cannot change your mind. And I want to be clear that there can sometimes be really tangible ramifications to this. I don't think people have pulled it out of nowhere. I remember, in the first book, I spoke to a student who I believe was a first generation college student, was working while in school full time. And they told me, people say it's okay if you fail. Well, for them, it really wasn't. If they failed a class and they couldn't afford to retake it, that had a really tangible impact on their future. And so while I totally agree in theory that failure is not final, I think we have to do a much better job structurally of supporting not just young adults, but everyone to actually make that so. And so I don't want to downplay how someone's experiencing failure or a setback, because I know that that can have really deep roots into how you live your life. But if you can, I would encourage you to think about change being a good thing, changing your interests, changing your mind, changing your career path. I think all of these things are kind of historically clocked as failures, as being all over the place, as not knowing what you're doing. And in reality, I think it's one of the most insightful, ambitious things we can ever ask ourselves to do is change our minds based on information we have learned and be committed to never stopping that learning process. And I think number three, the last thing I'll say that I think kind of spans both books and is something I wish I'd learned so much earlier in my life, is that whether you are talking about unionizing or organizing your workplace, whether you are just talking about the experiences you are having at work or at school or both, it is so important to try to establish connections with coworkers or people in the same field as you, with your friends, with your classmates. That's the thing that I think, at least for me, tended to float to the back burner while I was trying to figure out my school and my life and my work and all this other stuff. But that form of collectivity, of being in community with each other, of being able to show up for one another, I think is one of the most valuable, ambitious things we can possibly do. And I think now, looking back on my own young adulthood, I think that that's the thing that has changed my life the most since then. So I would encourage people, where you can, invest in that and really savor those relationships.
Yeah, no, great advice again. I actually, being the founder of ThirdPath, and this is our 24th year, I didn't think I understood how much building that community of people who wanted to work with us around the change we were doing was going to be the most important resource we created around change. So very, very good advice. Rainesford, I want to thank you again so much for being here today. We've got lots of free resources on our website that people can check out, including a great handout about some of these work-life integration skills that you can start developing early in your career. And, of course, you can join us this upcoming week when we have some young adults talking about some of this conversation that we have had with Rainesford today. And, really, Rainesford, you are such a great example of our mission of really trying to create a very different world for everybody, where we can afford to have time for work and the important relationships in our lives. Any last words you want to share, Rainesford? Thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you for giving me so much space to think out loud. I really appreciate it.
Well, really wonderful. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.